September 1919. Miss Bancroft, I said, returning the fallen napkins to the table and standing up. I extended a hand, and she stared at it before shaking it in a brisk, business-like fashion. "You found it all right, then?" she asked, and I nodded. "I arrived last night, actually. Shall we sit down?" "Can you excuse me for a moment, Mr. Sadler?" she said, taking off her coat. "I just want to freshen up." She walked towards a side door. I suspected that she had planned this maneuver. Step inside, say hello, size me up, disappear for a few minutes to gather her thoughts. As I waited, a young couple entered and sat down at a nearby table. I noticed a large burn mark on the young man's face and averted my gaze. In the far corner, I was dimly aware of the man who had come in earlier, staring in my direction, but then he moved out of view. "I'm sorry to have kept you waiting," said Marian Bancroft, returning to the table now and sitting down. As she did so, the young couple glanced across and whispered something to each other. Then they stood up, throwing unpleasant looks at us, and moved to a table by the furthest wall. Marian watched them go, before turning back to me with a curious expression on her face, a mixture of pain, resignation, and fury. "Did you say you arrived last night?" "Yes," I said, "on the late afternoon train." She smiled and looked away a moment. "Was it awful?" she said eventually, and I looked up, surprised that she should ask a loaded question so soon. "The train journey," she added quickly, noticing my disquiet. Of course it was natural that we should make small talk at first. It was hardly as if we could get straight into the reason for my visit. "I didn't mind it," I said. "I met someone I vaguely knew." She reached in her bag and removed a cigarette case, plucked out a cigarette, and offered a second to me. I shook my head. "You don't smoke?" she asked, lighting up. "I do, but I won't just now, if you don't mind." "Why should I mind?" "Oh, hello, Jane. Good morning." "Good morning, Marian," said the waitress who had approached. "Tea for two, Jane." The waitress nodded and walked away. "Jane is sweet. She used to play with me and—" She stopped herself, and her face fell as if she couldn't quite believe what she had been about to say. She took a drag from her tab, then pressed it out in the ashtray. "Do you know, I'm rather thinking of giving these things up." We didn't speak for a while, and it gave me an opportunity to examine her more closely. She was about 25, I imagined, but there was no wedding ring on her finger, so I assumed she was still unmarried. She didn't look very much like Will. He had been so dark and cheeky-looking, but she was much fairer. She looked over towards the counter where there was no sign of the waitress. "I'm thirsty. What's keeping her?" "I'm sure she'll only be a moment," I said. In truth, I was starting to feel rather unsettled and wondered why on earth I had decided to come here in the first place. It was clear that neither of us felt relaxed in the other's company. Miss Bancroft, Marian, drummed her fingers on the table and looked at the half-smoked cigarette. Eventually, she pulled open her bag and reached again for her cigarette case, which, when she retrieved it, slipped out of her hands and fell to the ground, scattering cigarettes around our feet. "Oh, hell! Look what I've done now." In a moment, Jane, our waitress, was beside us, reaching down to help gather them. "Never mind them, Jane," Miss Bancroft snapped. "I can pick them up. Can we just get our tea, please?" The arrival of the tea allowed us to focus on something trivial for a few minutes, rather than being forced to talk. Marian was clearly in a state of great tension and anxiety. In my selfishness, I had considered little but my own preoccupations before we met, but Will, after all, was her brother, and he was dead. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sadler," she said after a long silence, smiling across at me. "I can be an awful old hag sometimes." "There's nothing to apologize for, Miss Bancroft. This is not the most comfortable situation. No, she agreed. Can I ask you to call me Marion? Of course. And I'm Tristan. Well, Tristan, she hesitated, bit her lip. I suppose I should ask why you wrote to me. I cleared my throat. So here we are at last. I have something of Will's. My letters, yes. I don't mean this to sound critical, but you have held on to them for rather a long time. I assure you, I've never so much as opened an envelope. I don't doubt that for a moment. I wonder why you took so long to get in touch, that's all. I haven't been well, and I didn't feel I was up to meeting you. She looked out of the window a moment, and then turned back to me. Your letter came as more of a surprise to me than you might imagine. I had heard your name before. Oh, yes? I asked cautiously. Yes. Will wrote often, you know, particularly when he was at Aldershot. He told us about his routines and about some of the men who were training with him. And the man in charge, Clayton? I felt my body grow rigid at the name. I wondered how much she knew of Sergeant Clayton's responsibility in the whole business. Yes, I said. He was there from start to finish. I'd show you the letters, Tristan, but they are rather private. Of course, I said, not realizing how much I wanted to read them until she told me that I couldn't. The truth was, I'd never really given much consideration to their content. At Aldershot, I had never written to anyone. But once, during the course of the French campaign, I wrote a long letter to my mother asking her forgiveness for the pain I had caused. I attached a note to my father, telling him I was well, but I never received a reply. For all I knew, he had been first to pick the letter off the mat some morning, and had thrown it away before I could cast further shame on his household. Sergeant Clayton sounded like a terror, she remarked. He was a difficult man. When we were training, he was bad enough, but when we were over there... I shook my head. He'd been before, you see, and he'd lost 3 brothers in the fighting. But that doesn't excuse what he did. What did he do? I opened my mouth, fully aware that I was not yet ready to answer this question. I didn't know if I ever would be, for after all, to reveal Clayton's crime would be to admit my own. And I was here to return a packet of letters, I told myself. Nothing more. Did Will mention me much in those letters? I asked after a moment. He certainly did. I remember in his first letter from Aldershot, he told me about the chap who had the bunk next to his. A Londoner, he said, but not a bad bloke all the same. He told me how you and he would pal around together, how you're always there for him. And then there was all that business with Mr. Wolfe. Oh, he told you about him, did he? Not at first, but later. I could tell he was interested in Mr. Wolfe's beliefs, and then after he was murdered... It was never proven that Wolfe was murdered, I said irritably. Well, there was no doubt in my brother's mind. And after that, the carefree boy I had known vanished, and in came this new chap. A chap who wanted to talk about right and wrong. He wanted to know what the newspapers were saying about the war, whether anyone was standing up for the rights of man, as he called them, over the sound of rifles. And then... Well, you know what happened then. I nodded and sighed as we sat very quietly for a few moments. And did he say anything more about me? I asked eventually. I might never get the chance again, and I had to know. I had to know how he felt. I'm sorry, Tristan, she said, looking a little shamefaced. I have a rather awful thing to tell you. Perhaps I shouldn't. Please do. The truth is that you were such a big part of his letters all through that time at Aldershot. He told me all the things you did together and made you sound like a pair of mischievous children. I thought he was rather besotted with you, to be honest, as preposterous as that sounds. but could feel my face turning into a rictus of pain instead. Then he wrote to say that you had all shipped out, she continued. And from that first letter after you all left Aldershot, he never mentioned you again. And because you'd been such a big part of his earlier letters, I asked whether you were still in the same regiment. But you know we were, I said, confused. Yes, but when he replied, he told me... I'm sorry, Mr. Sadler, I mean Tristan. He said you'd been killed. He said that only 2 days after you left Aldershot, you were picked off by a sniper. I stared at her and began to feel dizzy. He said I was dead. It must have been someone else, she replied quickly. He must have just got it wrong. Anyway, as far as I was concerned, there was the two of you, thick as thieves, and off you go to France together, and the next thing I know, you're dead. And then, about 3 years later, out of the blue, your letter arrived. I turned and looked out of the window. Over the previous 12 months, I had felt such pain, such remorse over what happened to Will and my part in it. I had grieved so much too, my feelings for him so intense that I feared I would never be able to see past them. And now to hear this, to hear that he had effectively killed me off from that moment after our last night together at Aldershot. I had believed that he could not have broken my heart any more than he had. But now there was this. There was this. Mr. Sadler? Tristan. I turned back to her and saw that Marion was looking at my right hand with a concerned expression. It was twitching uncontrollably. You'll have to excuse me, I said, standing up quickly. Tristan, I'll be back, I said, rushing towards the door to the gents on the opposite side of the room. I saw the man who had entered the cafe earlier suddenly jump to his feet and march hurriedly towards me. I want a word with you, he said aggressively. Not now, I snapped. Get out of my way. I won't get out of your way. Now look here. Get out of my way, I shouted, and I pushed the man roughly aside. He didn't struggle with me, and a few minutes later I locked myself in the lavatory and placed my head in my hands, devastated. I was not crying, but there was a word being repeated over and over, I thought in my head, but actually aloud, and I had to make a concerted effort to stop myself saying, Will, as I rocked back and forth, as if this was the only word that had ever mattered, the only syllable that had any meaning for me.